Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Slavery Archive Book Club. Um, all of our moderators are here today. We have Ana Lucia Araujo from Howard University, Jessica Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, and Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky. And I'll be your main moderator today. I'm Alex Hill from Columbia University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the book club Takkara Brunson, who is going to be talking about her book, Black Women's Citizenship and the Making of Modern Cuba. Takkara Brunson is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University. Brunson's research focuses on political and cultural traditions of the African diaspora, with emphasis on how Black women have shaped Latin American and Caribbean societies after slave abolition. She is the author of Black Women's Citizenship and the Making of Modern Cuba by the University of Florida Press, published this year, and we'll be talking about this book today. Her research has appeared also in Gender and History and Meridian's Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, and Cuban Studies, among other places. Brunson's research has been supported by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, University of Rochester Frederick Douglass Institute, the Ford Foundation, and the UNCF Mellon programs. Now, the way that we usually operate in the club is that we invite our guests to speak for 25, 30 minutes. And after they are done, then we invite you to come and participate with us in a lively conversation. And we can do this in many ways. You can ask questions in the chat if you prefer for us to read them. You can come live on camera. This is being recorded, so if you come live on camera, you will be in the video that is saved for posterity on YouTube. And that's the third and final way to engage with us through YouTube itself. So we're broadcasting live. So if you are watching right now on YouTube and you want to ask a question, feel free after Takkara Brunson finishes her comments. We will look at your questions there and we'll answer them live here. So let me get out of the way now and pass the mic to Takkara, who will talk to us, will introduce to us her wonderful book. Thank you, Takkara, for coming. You're muted.
Got it. All right. Thank you again, Alex, for the introduction. I'd like to thank you and your co-organizers, Ana Lucia, Jessica, and Vanessa for having me today. It's an honor to be able to share my work as part of the Slavery Archive Book Club. I'd like to begin by briefly discussing how I came to this project, as well as my methods and some of the book's interventions. So first, I always have to credit my comparative women's studies major at Spelman College that led me to this project. One of my former advisors, Delita DeSouza, is in the audience, so hello. I began this project seeking to understand what Black feminist histories looked like beyond the United States, especially in Latin America. I then narrowed my focus to question what Black Cuban women's activist intellectual traditions looked like prior to the 1959 revolution. And there, as an undergraduate who had been thinking through Black women's traditions, I was astonished to find that no book-length study existed on Black women's lives in Cuba during the early 20th century. So there are two major fields that I used to begin to construct this history. The first field was that of women's activism during the Republican era, or the period that took place between 1902 and 1958, in which scholars like Lynn Stoner and Julio Cesar Gonzalez Pajes demonstrated how women activists achieved the right to divorce, women's suffrage, and the ratification of the 1940 Constitution. The 1940 Constitution made illegal any discrimination on the basis of race, sex, color, or class. Stoner, and more recently, historian Michelle Chase, have demonstrated how women activists appeal to patriarchal discourses of motherhood in order to enter into political debates. While each of these studies reference women of African descent, Black women were largely absent as contributors to these major reforms. Observing this, I wondered what happened. Did Black women confront exclusion because of their race? Did they have different goals? Did they even form their own organizations? Second, the book engages the field of race and Cuban nationhood. Here are scholars who include Tomás Fernández Robaina, Eileen Helg, Alejandro de la Fuente, Melina Papademos, and Bonnie Lucero have analyzed how Cuban nationalist narratives proclaim the creation of a racial egalitarian, even raceless nation in which all men receive political rights. These scholars emphasize how African-descended men shape national politics. They accurately asserted that Black women rarely took on formal roles within Black civic clubs due to patriarchal gender expectations. But I still wondered what Black women had done as they sought to improve their lives. How did their desires and goals compare with their Black male and white female counterparts? What did the forms of political action they took reveal about social dynamics in an evolving political system? And so historically, you have the establishment of a Cuban nation in 1902, in which all men receive suffrage rights and women's activism achieves major legal rights on their behalf by 1934, and women received the right to vote in Cuba in 1934. Yet Black women were largely absent from this narrative. This resulted in part because of who historians have understood to be the key players in national movements. It has also resulted from assumptions among some that archives even lack the sources necessary to even construct a book-length study of African-descended women's political contributions. And so initially I consulted the sources used by these scholars. These sources included Black and mainstream presses, the records of Black civic clubs, women's groups, labor unions, and the Communist Party, as well as letters and census data. I found women of African descent to be everywhere. Black women educators, tobacco stemmers, housewives, lawyers, and factory and domestic workers moved between these same movements for democratic reform throughout the Republican era. Now, there was an additional point made by the Black Cuban historian Oilde Evia Lanier, in which she asserts that we cannot understand Black political activism during the 20th century without examining the late 19th century. So slavery came to an end during the final decades of Spanish colonialism in 1886. Persons of African descent took advantage of new rights to establish presses and associations. They forged the civil rights campaign that challenged anti-Black discrimination throughout the island. Notably, in 1888, 2 years after slave abolition, literate persons of African descent established Minerva, a bi-weekly magazine dedicated to women of color. The magazine featured Black men and especially women as writers. Black women writing for Minerva hailed from across the island. Some were born free, while others were born into slavery and eventually emancipated. Many worked as seamstresses, midwives, businesswomen, and educators. They promoted racial uplift, or the idea that persons of African descent needed to remove themselves from the veil of slavery through thrift, forming married households, obtaining an education, and embracing proper social customs. They also confronted anti-Black racism through the magazine. For instance, poet and educator Cristina Ayala affirmed the need for racial uplift while emphasizing that white Cubans were responsible for the conditions under which persons of African descent had lived. A woman who used the pen name Africa Cespedes challenged the dominant idea that Black women, in particular mixed race women, threatened national progress due to their perceived immorality. And this is where I began to, in developing the story, identify the beginning of a tradition of political activism through which Black women intervened in the nation's formation and state claims as citizens. Indeed, comparing this first iteration of Minerva to its second phase, which was published between 1910 and 1915, revealed a shift in how elite women of African descent engaged racial politics. The same women who publicly condemned instances of anti-Black racism during the late 19th century became silent on issues of racism following the establishment of the Republic in 1902. Few women writing for the magazine even identified as being persons of color in their writings. And so certainly it was known that this was a publication by persons of African descent, but they would rarely even identify in their writings as being of the colored race or of the Ethiopian race. Elite Black men during this time became the primary group to challenge racism within the public sphere. Now, this distinction between how men and women of African descent addressed racism led me to emphasize citizenship practices. The story was not just that Black women appeared in the same documents as Black men, or that they took on informal roles in Black political and social spaces. It was that their goal of demonstrating their fitness for citizenship as Cuban women led them to adopt unique strategies. I thus set out to trace the political communities that they engaged, looking at how they engaged particular movements and how those actions contributed to democratic reform. I also questioned why elite and upwardly mobile women of African descent employed particular strategies in comparison to those of Black men and white women. So this led to how I chose to structure the book, which focuses on their particular citizenship practices. And so I'll use the rest of my opening time to talk about how I've organized the book by chapter. Chapter 1 argues that women played a critical role in building a Black public sphere during the late 19th century. It asserts that elite and upwardly mobile women took on public roles as writers and organizers, right? Oftentimes appearing as the editors of the more than 100 publications that appeared during the final decades of the 19th century. It also looks at the organizations that they established, some of which were mutual aid associations. Others increasingly took on a civic club structure similar to those that would appear in the early 20th century. And I argue that here, elite and upwardly mobile Black women took on public roles as writers and social organizers that actually set them apart from their white counterparts, right? In this case, many Black women embrace more progressive gender roles that white women would take on following the establishment of the Republic. Chapters 2 and 3 analyze how Black women responded to early Republican ideas of race and womanhood. While elite women of African descent rarely spoke about race in public venues, they submitted private letters to politicians like the African-descended leader Juan Gualberto Gomez in order to navigate discriminatory practices in education and employment. A broader community of Black women who hailed from a range of class backgrounds supported the Black political party, the Independent Colored Party, which existed between 1908 and 1912. These women submitted letters to the PIC Press, or the Independent Colored Party Press, that supported its mission of promoting race pride, achieving labor reform, and obtaining dignity for Black men and women. In chapter 3, I returned to the newspapers and magazines published by elite Black men in order to discuss how women supported racial advancement goals while adhering to the tenets of racial silence. I contend that comportment became a central political strategy through which women of African descent sought to challenge elite white assumptions that they lacked respectability. So again, few women talked about the instances of racial discrimination that they confronted, yet they published photographs, announced marriages, baptisms, school graduations, and they occasionally formed women's organizations for Black women that all helped demonstrate that Black women were capable of racial integration. Chapter 4 focuses on the evolution of Black Cuban feminist thought. Women writing for the second iteration of Minerva published a feminist column between 1910 and 1913 that predated the feminist magazines of their white counterparts. They addressed similar themes that included women's rights and their duties as mothers and wives. They promoted women's education as well. Their essays and poetry also buttressed the broader platform for racial equality. Yet by the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Black feminists moved away from this conservative platform as they formulated an intersectional analysis of their experiences. Here they emphasize their particular experiences as Black mothers and workers, They called attention to how sexism, racism, and labor discrimination simultaneously maintain their marginalization. This led Black feminists to conclude that the principles of racial democracy remained unrealized. The next chapter looks at another aspect of Black feminist thought and activism, or that of how women of African descent moved from the Black public sphere into national organizations during the 1920s and 1930s. So one of the points that I make in the book is that during the shift from the late 19th century into the 20th century, Black women moved from formally leading their own organizations into taking on roles within women's auxiliary branches of male-headed institutions. Yet by the 1920s, they became increasingly critical of the patriarchal nature of most Black civic clubs. I also emphasize how elite Black women formed alliances with elite white women, as well as poor Black and white women. These alliances resulted in Black women achieving formal leadership positions at the national level of the women's movement. And literally you see them across the island, establishing a range of organizations, some of which are focused on social welfare reform, of responding to the local needs of their communities. Others include radical labor groups seeking to challenge capitalism on the island and US imperialism as well. By the late 1930s, as I note, the 1939 National Cuban Women's Conference features Black women as prominent leaders helping to organize this conference. And in doing so, they help to bring their particular concerns into the platform of the conference, presenting it as critical to achieving true democratic reform. The 1940 Constitution resulted in part from Black women's cross-racial organizing during the late 1930s, and yet their objectives remained unfulfilled. The final two chapters examine two political communities through which women of African descent continue to press for democratic reform. On one hand, as I discussed in chapter 6, Black women professionals like Ana Echegoyen employed a moderate political approach in which they entered into politics through civic organizations, right? So few Black women, despite the work that they had done and the successes that they had achieved during the 1930s, ever held positions in the national political parties during the 1940s and 1950s. Instead, women like Echegoyen appeared in civic associations that promoted Afro-Cuban culture, racial equality, as well as educational reform. Importantly, these organizations rarely spoke to the particular concerns of Black women, especially poor Black women. Now, on the other hand, as I show in the final chapter, radical Black women like Esperanza Sanchez used the Communist Party to achieve reforms. The Communist Party served as the most successful political organization that elevated women of all races to formal leadership positions, especially women of African descent from working class backgrounds. And indeed, Black women from poor and working class backgrounds ran for office in the Communist Party at all levels, from their local neighborhoods to their municipalities through the National Congress. Sanchez became the first Black woman elected to the Senate as a Communist Party representative. She worked alongside other Black women who achieved labor reforms on behalf of mothers and pregnant women, as well as higher wages and government transparency. Now, ultimately, I conclude that Black women of all class backgrounds continue to confront discrimination due to the fact that Cubans did not censor the intersectional approach presented by Black women activists as they pursued democratic reforms during previous decades. This, of course, was the result of anti-Black racism that continued within various political movements. It also resulted from ongoing patriarchal attitudes on the island. But to conclude, I hope the book demonstrates the various ways that women of African descent move Cuba closer towards achieving social equality in the pursuit of rights, material resources, and social recognition. And I also hope that the book continues to stimulate conversations about Black feminist histories throughout the African diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you, Takkara, and thank you for writing. That was awesome. Also, I didn't come through right away when I was reading the book that this is the first time that anything as comprehensive as this has ever been done. And it's mostly because I come at the history of Black women in Cuba through sort of like culture. That is my own background. So while everybody gets warmed up and starts thinking of questions for Takkara, I think I'll get us started with that first question of like, I think we see Minerva and we see some of these other cultural efforts in the first chapter, but then culture itself seems to recede a little bit as an instrument in the way that it is such an instrument in the creation of that public sphere in the beginning, and we transition to more of like political class struggles, but like for example in the 30s and 40s, so figures like Lidia Cabrera, who are super important in my world, but don't play a role here, and all the way to Princeton, like to Nancy Morejon and all these other figures, which dominate a lot of our thinking on I'm a literature scholar, sorry, on our side of the house of what we understand a little bit of this history to be, and of course I see now how incomplete everything that I ever thought was, like how rich what you give us is. But I was wondering if you actually made that conscious choice if that was a conscious choice to try to shift the conversation away from this kind of like other genealogies and other women that people like me are more familiar with.
Yes. Part of that was the historiography that I responded to, which again was looking at the field of Cuban women's activism, political activism, and then Black political activism, and trying to figure out where Black women fit into that. I really began the research by looking at the footnotes of those scholars and trying to identify the occasions in which Black women had created the sources that they use, and then to reconstruct their activism and the communities that they joined. Certainly I see the book as complementing the important work that's been done in the field of Cuban literature, because that's where, when I began this project, most of the work had been done in thinking about Black Cuban women's contributions to building a modern nation, especially within the cultural realm, but kind of leaving to the side some of the formal political activism that they had done, and that was equally important. Yes, thank you for that question.
And thank you for changing everything we thought and adding all this rich material. So I hope everybody's getting warmed up, and we are going to open the floor for you to ask questions. You can ask them in the chat again, and like I said at the beginning, you can ask them in the chat and we'll read them for you if you don't feel comfortable coming in on camera. Of course, we always prefer for you to come here and so Takkara can see you and ask your question. Do we have any takers? I think Natalie, you have your hands raised. Why don't you join us?
Dr. Brunson, thank you so much for your presentation of your book. I have a couple of questions. One, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about your personal experience as a historian in the physical archive itself. I think that as we continue to build this work around slavery archives, particularly as Black women going into these spaces, how do you navigate? So that's just a method question. My second question is, if these women didn't self-identify as Black women, how are you tracing their racialization in their produced documents? And my final question is, are these civic clubs clustered in particular regions in Cuba, or is this a island-wide phenomena? Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Can you repeat the last question of the civic clubs clustered?
In particular regions in Cuba, or is it an island-wide, nationwide phenomena?
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Awesome. So in terms of your first question, my personal experience in the physical archive, I think what is really interesting is when I first started doing research in Cuba in 2008, I was kind of steered away from being open about my project because of how previous scholars had, the responses that previous scholars had received when coming into Cuban institutions and talking about researching Black people in particular. There were at least a couple of occasions in which scholars mentioned being seen as divisive for having even talked about Black people and how that undermined national narratives in the 21st century. And so a lot of the work that I did, I really just presented myself as studying Cuban women across social groups. And so I think in doing that, I was able to feel fairly comfortable and have really open access to archives, not just in Havana, but throughout the island. What was interesting is, especially as I left Cuba and went to some of the smaller communities, even in places like Santiago, is that you would occasionally encounter other Black librarians or archivists. And so they would kind of push me trying to figure out what exactly I was doing, what particular questions I asked. And then once they realized that I was studying Black women, then they were excited and we were able to have more direct conversations. Certainly over time that's changed. So by the time I completed my PhD and was returning to conduct follow-up research for the book, there was a much more open movement of Black women scholars in Havana especially, but also island-wide, who were engaging in these questions, regularly publishing on Black women's experiences historically, but also in terms of literature, culture, publishing anthologies on Black women's history. And so they really helped to create space for me to feel even more comfortable having these conversations in some of the established institutions through which I facilitated my research. In terms of your second question, and how the women identified, so it's a really interesting question because I'm sure there are just so many other stories that could be told if I had the race of women whose names I came across in the archive. What I chose to do instead was to begin with the women who belonged to organizations who published in presses that I knew were organized by persons of African descent, and then to begin moving from there. I also, in the case of like the Communist Party, for instance, would see photographs in the communist newspapers and then could connect like, oh, here's like a darker face in the newspaper. Let me see where I can go with this. And I might trace them to particular neighborhoods that were known as being predominantly Black. I especially would note those women if they ever talked about being Black, especially once you get to the 1930s and occasionally the 1940s, and then tried to connect the dots that way. Just in focusing on the women who occasionally identified as Black, mestiza, mulata, and as well as connecting them to recognized Black institutions and publications, I was able to create an archive that was enough to construct a political history and to get a sense of what they were doing. But again, your question's interesting because there's so many other ways that we could think about Black women's experiences and being able to think about the racial identities of women who I may have overlooked and what me overlooking their racial identity might say about how they navigated national politics during this period. In terms of your final question with Black civic clubs, so I mentioned, reference the communities of Havana, but this absolutely was a practice that took place in cities throughout the island, from the larger cities like Havana and Santiago down to smaller cities in which you had anywhere from 2 to like 20 civic clubs that were documented by the local government. Again, there, part of it required that I mine the social columns of regional newspapers and to get a sense of how they connected. So you might know that these male politicians were Black. You occasionally might find someone who talked about being Black, and some occasionally in their actual like registers, they might note being an association for Black people, for mulattoes in particular. And but there was certainly overlap because they were also in conversation with each other, as well as Cuban exile communities and immigrant communities. Thank you.
Dr. Brunson, thank you so much. That's such a brilliant strategy of connecting the dots in that way, because coming from the US, we have such a very unique understanding of race, so that when we're thinking about race across the diaspora, we have to come up with different strategies of locating racialized people. So thank you so much for pointing out how you were able to do that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, even just to follow up on that point, again, that's why I tried to focus on political strategy. So like thinking about the late 19th century, for instance, I anticipated finding like a Black women's club movement on the island. They did not have a Black women's club movement. So then one of my questions became, why did they not have a Black women's club movement? What were their priorities instead? And then what were they responding to, both in terms of racial dynamics, but racial dynamics as they intersected with gender expectations during the period?
Jessica. I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, sorry. I thought somebody was before me. But hey, hi everyone. Takkara, I'm so excited about this work and about especially to have it and have this presentation and this workshop and event in Latinx Heritage Month and thinking about the Black presence across so many spaces, so many Spanish-speaking spaces. I was wondering if you could talk the kind of research you were doing, particularly around Black women's organizing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, just broadly about how you think about text sources versus other kinds of sources. I feel like there's so many ways that the historiography, the methodology that gets applied to a place like Cuba and the diaspora of, that emerges and is generated out of Cuba is, there's a methodology that is really focused on sound, on spirit, on things that are maybe less textual. Although we know that music and spirit and these are also texts. But then there's also other kinds of archives, and I think you were also doing some of that work. So I was wondering like how you thought about that tension, how you might situate yourself in a historiography. Is there something to text heavier sources over others that is worth talking about when we're trying to think about how we situate Black women in particular in a modern, in these discussions of modernity versus whatever other thing gets put against modernity, which I feel like is sort of what I see, that tension happening with the Black women and thinking about citizenship and their position in Cuba and the Caribbean and diaspora broadly. So wherever you want to take that, I know it's kind of a really broad question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So again, just by mining the sources that historians had already used to think about Cuban political history, I found so much information that I chose to stop there. And I'm content with that, but I also think that one of the limitations of this is that I didn't do enough oral histories, for instance. And again, part of that was because of how I had been prepared for entering into Cuba. But there are just other priorities that you see in having conversations with Black Cuban women about what their lives were like, how they experienced their identities as women of African descent, and then the ways that having those conversations shifts your thinking away from citizenship in the state to other conversations about labor, about cultural dynamics, about like just neighborhoods. I've thought about doing more work and just thinking about how like structures, for instance, and the engagement of Black women with structures, whether it be a block, whether it be living in particular apartment units and the various Black communities that they encountered, which included like West Indian communities, especially in many of the cities, how that shaped their ideas about citizenship and social belongings and their strategies for rights. I also recognize that there's an entirely different dimension that I chose not to really think about, and that involves spiritual communities. There are some scholars who've begun to do that work. There's certainly so much more that can be done in moving backwards and thinking about what those histories look like during the late 19th and into the 20th century. And again, there are scholars who've done that, but I think there are many more ways that we can incorporate spiritual communities with political communities in order to complicate how we're thinking about Black women's identities, relationships to communities, and the nation. But I also, and this is why chapter 3 focuses on comportment, I was trying to make sense of the fact that even using traditional text used by scholars of Cuban politics, that even if you just looked at these newspapers, there were all these fragments that I was trying to figure out how to piece together. So there were like hundreds of names that I came across that literally were like, this particular woman graduated from this school last week. This particular woman was baptized. This particular woman founded this library or had this performance. But aside from that, there was no other biographical information. Sometimes you might see the elections of like a women's auxiliary committee board, but then there's no discussion of their activities. And so I tried to figure out, by doing a cultural reading, how could I make sense of what kept appearing throughout the Black press? And there I chose to think about comportment, so the types of activities they're engaging in, why they're doing it, to reconstruct what this might look like. I also noticed that photography regularly appeared throughout the Black press. And so photography then became crucial to understanding how they were trying to present themselves as respectable women and to state claims as citizens. And so moving forward, that's one of the questions that I'm returning to, is thinking about photographic archives in the diaspora, because that in itself opens up all sorts of other ways that they are fashioning their identities, connecting with communities in dynamic ways that move beyond politics, that move beyond Cuban borders. But I'm also appreciating your comments about sound and spirit, because those are other literatures that I need to engage. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, I think it's so, bringing these together in particular kinds of ways is so rich. I mean, it just really kind of paints, not paints, but like, you know, reveals the truth of the kind of complexity of Black women as subjects, but also like the politics, right? That it does happen in, you know, in sound and in spirit and other capacities, but it's also in the press. Like it's also happening in text. It's happening in what is considered sort of more formal, almost conservative venues of political action. But it's also all happening at the same time. And it seems like the historiography has done this weird separation, but you know, your work is also kind of bringing that together and challenging those kind of boundaries between how we think about what politics even looks like. So it's really exciting. Thank you for your work.
Rosemary Field.
Feal, Alex, feal, es español. Hello, Takkara. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your work. I really enjoyed hearing about what your thinking is and what your research shows. You know, one question I had, and it's kind of following up on what Nathalie Pierre was saying, is about the concept of race itself and the identity that the women that you've researched and spoken about, how they self-identify, how the broader culture looks at them, how the, what you just call the comportment, the structures that you looked at in which women are in political action, in with respect to the Communist Party and so on. So I'm wondering where race fits in as far as a changeable concept, what happens both on the individual and collective level in what you're researching. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Thank you for your question. I'm trying to think through this. So what I try to emphasize in the book is how they're engaging racial politics certainly acknowledging how they're identifying, also recognizing how the language shifts in talking about race. So for instance, in the late 19th century, many of the women, and into the early 20th century as well, persons of African descent oftentimes identify as persons of color, right? This allows room to talk about being like Black, mulatto, occasionally mestizo, but by the 1920s, that kind of falls away and they are openly identifying as just Black people. And so I talk about like the factors that led to that shift, how that leads to a new idea about Blackness and the national politics, and then how that shifts how they relate to each other, including some of the shifting gender dynamics within Black communities. In terms of comportment, I was thinking more so about racial stereotyping and how Black men and women use their bodies to push back against those stereotypes. So if you have these images circulating of them that present them as backwards witchcraft practitioners, as hypersexual mulattas, in what ways are they using visual images, dances, weddings, in ways that are almost identical to what their white counterparts are doing? But then what does it mean for them to be in a Black body engaging in these same practices? And how does that then become a political strategy? Again, moving forward, thinking about like this cultural component and the more nuanced ways that they push back against these stereotypes. It's sometimes appropriating the stereotypes and engaging images and discussions of Afro-Cuban culture by the 1920s, 1930s, in a way that allows them to have conversations around Blackness, but also African culture and identity, is something that I'm using photography to think through. And so I begin it here in that chapter on comportment, but there's certainly more work to be done in fleshing out that process and what it looks like.
Thank you so much.
Okay, let me ask.
Ana Lucia? Yeah.
Okay, I think it's me. Takkara, thank you so much for this book. And I hope that from here we can have much more studies focusing on many of the aspects that you bring in this work. One of the questions that I ask myself is about the international dimension of the activism of these Black women in Cuba that you focus on the book. If you could develop a little bit more on the international connections that these Black women will establish. And the second component would be about their participation, their connections with the Communist Party. I remember that Queen Audley Moore here in the United States, then she was Garvey, and then she joined the Communist Party here in the United States. But at some point she left the party, and one of the complaints that she had at the time was the fact that the question of race, even if it was one of the parties that focused on this, that the connections with Africa, the question of race were not important in the party. And another component that she brings in in an interview that she gave is the fact that women, they were excluded, that they were always behind the scenes. I would like to know if, in the case of Cuba, we know the problems regarding the issue of race and the Communist Party, but if you could develop a little bit more based on what you do in the book regarding then the connections between race and the Communist Party associated with this Black women, and also the kind of positions that they could have in that structure that in other places excluded women as other parties did.
Yes, thank you for your question. In terms of the international dimensions, there's just so much to be done that I just referenced and then kind of kept it moving, right? So one of the references I made was to women who entered into exile communities during the 19th century independence movement, who ended up working in Southern Florida and Lake Ybor City, as well as New York City, and the connections that they maintained with, well, I reference it, but that they maintain connections with African Americans, that they established organizations there, as well as the connections that they maintained with persons of African descent back on the island. I also talk about the Oblate Sisters of Providence. So for people unfamiliar with it, it's the first Catholic sisterhood founded by women of African descent by a Cuban woman of African descent who comes to the United States during the 1810s, and then who settles in Baltimore and establishes a mission that's still in existence today outside of Baltimore. In 1900, during the US occupation, the Oblates began establishing institutions on the island. I think they established about 6 missions throughout the island, including Havana and Santiago. And then those organizations, in many ways, do work that's similar to what HBCUs are doing in the United States. And so, again, there's a whole other book to be written there, but I reference how that organization reflects the ways that Black women lean on educational institutions, and in this case, a transnational Black women's institution, in order to create opportunities for Black children to be educated, for Black children to be socialized, and how they're moving back and forth between Cuba and the United States as a part of this, especially those who become sisters. Finally, during the 1920s and 1950s, I talk about how women like Ana Echegoyen organized alongside the National Council of Negro Women, with a delegation coming from the United States down to Havana in 1940, and the types of conversations that they're having. What's important is that it's one of the few instances where we see Black women during the 1940s engaging in this conversation about Black womanhood. And it's the NCNW, or the National Council of Negro Women, that helps to create that space. And there's at least one letter in which a woman from the island writes Mary McLeod Bethune, seeking to establish a similar organization in the eastern part of the island. So there are all these transnational stories that could be told. In my study, they're primarily references connected to broader political actions that they're engaging in during the period. In terms of the Communist Party in many ways is so successful at mobilizing Black women. What is fascinating about it is during the late 1930s, again, they're supporting these conversations about Black women's particular experiences. Following the ratification of the 1940 Constitution, a shift takes place in which women are kind of pushed over to their own organizations that parallel the National Party, even though you have exceptions in which figures like Esperanza Sanchez are represent the party at the national level, and they're certainly writing for the Communist Press. But in these separate women's organizations, they're really doing important work in terms of mobilizing women in support of the parties, in organizing local campaigns to demand higher wages, to call out the government for corruption, to demand transparency. They are achieving like labor reforms in local factories and other employment sectors, as well as helping to shape some of the agendas of the National Congress in instituting reforms on behalf of women workers. And so in terms of racial politics, it's interesting because they're not really talking about race, they're just talking about Cuban womanhood broadly. And in passing, they say like, oh, Black and white women, like urban and rural women, women of the factories, housewives, poor women, professionals, and so forth. And it's really the men, both Black and white, who are having these conversations on the side in terms of racial progress that needs to be made. I think part of that is the strategy of the Communist Party nationally, but there are just so many other successes that they're able to make through this cross-racial collaboration that takes place among women in their parallel organizations. And the last thing I'll just add to that is, Sanchez actually leaves the party by the early 1950s. And so there's speculation about whether this relates to her, well, the Communist Party accuses her of abandoning her post, right? And of abandoning the goals of the communist movement. She does appear in another political organization years later. So I don't know if this is because she has a change of heart, if it's because she feels like she's limited in organizing within the party, if she perhaps joins another political community that better serves her interests. But there is some tension there that as of yet, I haven't been able to really get up beyond speculation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You reminded me of MSSR breaking the Communist Party in 1957. But that one we know that it was because he said the Communist Party wasn't thinking about race. So we have, I don't want to speculate on Esperanza, but Raquel Otegi has a question. You don't have to turn your camera on if you just want to. She wants to ask it live, but we encourage you to turn your camera on if you're comfortable.
Thank you, Alex. Takkara, it's so wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for this important book. As you know, your work has been so important for me for so many years, so it's nice to be here. So I have, I guess, just two things that I'd love to hear you talk about, two questions. The book is you are so good at tracing women's political activism, Black women's political activism in these really nuanced ways, and seeing it, like seeing the different ways that they are fighting for rights or performing citizenship or, pursuing racial or social equality, like in ways that are sometimes like, hard to see and hard to like understand what exactly is happening. And so I really admire all these different modes of kind of activism that you identify and that you explore. And obviously you have like this very rich period that a lot is happening in, that's like very changing context. And I'm just, I just want to kind of hear you talk about what you think about, like, I mean, I don't want to cast judgment on our historical subjects, but like what you think about the efficacy of these political strategies. And again, these are very difficult moments. And so again, no judgment, but like, does the story leave you pessimistic? Does the story leave you optimistic? Because there are moments of what seem like of downturns, right? Of stepping back in terms of how radical these women can be or how much change they can demand throughout your story. And so what's your sort of feeling about the framing of it? Is it an optimistic story, or is it maybe a more negative story, or a more pessimistic story? And how does the timing, which is, quite long, but how does the timing of your story, I know you have a lot going on, but like how does that timing, how does the narrative frame shape whether it's an optimistic or pessimistic story, if you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then the second part of the story, my second question is entirely self-serving, but your book, in a lot of ways, the Black women that you write about are responding to national political movements. They're responding to obviously this, racism in Cuba. They are responding to white women in particular, sometimes in white women's organizations, or white feminist goals in particular. And so, but as in certain periods, they are kind of proponents of racial uplift strategies, right? And as such, they are like, it's like a little bit of a lift as you climb, or we are the 10%, but, we represent, los otros, and then, or las otras. And then, so is there any way to use the sources that we have of Black elite women to tell maybe a story of, working class Black women or poor Black women, or enslaved Black? I mean, I guess you start a little bit after slavery, or no, you start right around then. But yeah, like, can you use those sources not only to look at like how Black women are responding to kind of, white supremacist structures, but also how, is there a story that could be told about other Black women using elite Black women sources?
Thank you for both of those questions. In terms of the efficacy of political strategies, I can't say positive or negative. In some ways, I mean, it's so like you go, you know, one of the experiences I had in the archive is you go into the archive, you're conducting this research, you're seeing the moves that they make, sometimes the gains that they make, and then you leave the archive and have conversations with Black women about very similar struggles that they're confronting in the 20th century, right? And there I'll just like encourage people to look at the work being done by Black women in Cuba today, where they in some ways are articulating very similar experiences to those that their ancestors would have had a century ago. And so I think what I hope is that the book can contribute to conversations about the persistence of anti-Black racism and patriarchy, despite formal political gains being made. I think this also gets back to the question that Alex opened with and thinking about the realm of culture and how culture has been a way for Black women to insert themselves into Cuban nationhood, national identity in ways that can be progressive, but how culture can also be a way of maintaining anti-Black racism, misogynoir on the island and really diasporically, right? So I guess it's hard to say like pessimistic or optimistic. I just think that what's interesting is you can make political gains in certain ways, like better wages, better working conditions, political rights, but that doesn't necessarily transform Black women's circumstances in the short or especially the long term, if that makes sense, right? Second, in responding to national political movements and working class and poor Black women, I try to emphasize how, in the book, how acknowledge that many of the strategies that elite Blacks use are in fact elitist and continue to marginalize poor African descendants or poor Black folks who either are unable to, in many cases, I believe, refuse to adhere to these dominant ideas of assimilation and how one should perform citizenship. Certainly you could look at, say, the African-based cultural communities that exist in Cuba as reflecting another way or representing another way of existing on the island. And so that I think is where one of the ways where historians could go to think about a history of working class or poor Black communities is to start with spiritual communities and the ways that they're engaging dominant ideas, rejecting them and creating other models. What is also interesting is some of the figures that I talk about in the book are also a part of these religious communities or spiritual communities. But because I don't see it in the archives, this is more so conversations that I've had outside of archives, I chose not to emphasize that in the book just because I wasn't really comfortable in going there without the evidence. But again, you could probably write an entire article, if not book, on other communities that African descended women belong to beyond these elitist communities and strategies that they were using. A final way in which you could look at working class and poor Black women would be through the story of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, where many of the women who would become sisters, educators, came from poor Black backgrounds. It's an institution that consistently educated poor Black children, right? There's photographs full of all the different religious rites that they went through, parades that they held, and so forth. That's fairly well documented at the archive that is outside of Baltimore, and at times the Cuban press, but even like the Black press in the US does well in documenting these traditions and acknowledging the various backgrounds of many of the people who enter into these schools. And then finally, the Communist Party. Like when you look at the communist newspapers and magazines, that's where you really see the stories about people from working class backgrounds who are living in housing that's falling apart, who talk about like struggling to feed their children, who are putting forth reforms that would address material issues rather than just getting access to political representation or professional labor or social recognition as respectable women. Yeah, so thank you for those questions.
Thank you, Caro Moret.
Thank you, Professor Takkara, for this presentation. Muchísimas gracias. I would like to say that your book should be translated, and I hope that it will be translated soon in my Cuba, because we need it, and I'm sure that my colleague in Cuba, mis compañeros, la gente con la que yo he estudiado, my people in Cuba need to read that book in Spanish, and so I hope that you get translated that book in Spanish as soon as possible. My question should be around the religious or traditional religious dimension of these women. I mean, the connection with that. I'm very interested about if you were able to trace in the archive if these women have any connection openly. I'm sure private they did, but in some way openly to the African traditional religions that we have in Cuba. What I have found is that, of course, there is a lot of statements of the male leaders about these traditional religions that, you know, it's a little bit surprising because they were Black, they were leaders, they in some point they were in front of a whole community and represent that. But what is controversial is that the most of these statements are that they are in front. I mean, is that they were not talking very well about these traditional religions that we have in Cuba. It was a kind of a statement of we need to abandon for the progress. And you mentioned before about the connection of all these communities and association of these women with the religious, especially Christian or Catholic movement in some point, and they became leader of that, very connected with the education. So my question is, if you found another kind of religion, no Christian, I mean, in a traditional way, Afro descendants or African or whatever. I'm talking about Santeria, because those years, we know in those years, the war against our traditional religions in Cuba were very on the press. I mean, the publications and then these controversial discourses and statement of our Black male leaders. So yeah, well, you understand what I mean. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. I really hope to sometime soon have it translated, because ultimately I want the review of my Cuban colleagues. In terms of traditional religions, absolutely, they are not publicly celebrating African spiritual traditions, right? Throughout the late 19th and into the 20th century, most of the conversation that takes place, which really is the discourse put forth by men more so than women, is of course that these traditions are backwards and that they're holding back the race. There is, by the late 1920s, early 1930s, some pushback, but only in the sense that some Black women say our cultural practices have nothing to do with why we're not progressing. We're not progressing because of racism, sexism, and economic exploitation, right? But in terms of them publicly discussing being a part of any non-Catholic communities, no. And it's interesting because there are at least two instances that I can think of where women who are educators are proudly proclaiming their Catholic identity into the 1940s. But when you talk about their parents who enter national political life during the late 19th century, those same parents were speculated as having belonged to the African spiritual communities. So again, the question is just like, are they choosing to present themselves as being Catholic and able to affirm a particular model of respectability that continues throughout the Republican era? Have they distanced themselves from it? Again, I think this is why moving forward, photography is interesting, because you can actually look at images of certainly Black women cultural performances like Eusebio Cosme during the 1930s and 1940s, who were adopting aspects of African spiritual traditions, at least in terms of dress, the poetry that they perform, and so forth, as being a way of thinking about shifts. But I would imagine that even looking at like street photography, that gives better insights into these communities beyond what like elite Black men and women are saying in particular that tends to be disparaging. Yeah. And also, of course, oral histories would really help uncover more, because that's where the textual sources that I used are also limited. Yeah. Thank you.
Laura Adderley, there you are.
You are muted.
Takkara, congratulations. I have not read it. You're a century late for me. I have so many questions though. I'm just super excited to see you and to know that the book is here. And the older I get, the more feminist I become, so it's all good. I had a question hearing you talk about your sources and thinking about what I do know about the early 20th century in terms of the discourses going on in African diaspora circles that both included women and sort of included them in leadership, but then had these kind of, depending on what moment it was, these kind of oddly idealized visions of what role the woman is supposed to be playing in racial uplift. And, you know, we a wonderful student at Tulane now, Caleb Smith, who works on labor organizing, is super interested and obsessed with the paper. And I want, you know, he's like, kind of like the women that are involved in these like race lives everywhere, except they're not. And sometimes they talk about what role they think these women should be playing in the kinds of projects of either racial uplift or national uplift. Because I get it sometimes when it's not race. And I wondered if you could say where that is, if it is in your sources, that there is, you know, what is the sort of the expectation of, and I'll put it in sort of parentheses, Black women's roles in these projects of advancing.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that question. So similar to other post-abolition Black diasporic communities, the expectation is that women's roles lay in their contributions to uplifting the race, first and foremost by being moral. So abstaining from sex until they get married, only having children in a marriage that's been validated by the Catholic Church, that their roles in the community need to primarily take place through associations headed by men, that their roles are seen as complementary to those as men, that they are to work towards uplifting the race as well as the nation as proper mothers and wives. That's where their role as education comes in, whether it be in local communities, in their households, or in schools. But what's interesting in thinking about this shift from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, they appear to have had a broader idea of what women could do, but yet as they increasingly, especially as elite Black men increasingly embrace this emergent idea of what it meant to be a Cuban citizen, women kind of fall in line and take on increasingly not just complementary roles, but taking on roles within male-headed institutions rather than organizing their own independent or institutions that would be formally registered with the government. And so that in itself shapes the types of activities that they're engaging in and changes how they're publicly talking about racial politics. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I'm gonna, because I was thinking about, and this is the out part of it, I'm like the grandchild of someone who was in a gardening club that was considered an appropriate Black nationalist beautification project. I was just like, you know, that if we're gonna end colonialism, like what can you do if you wanna be out in the world? And you could do certain kinds of things, you could do certain kinds of public projects, but not too much.
Yeah. And I will add, it shifts. So there's definitely an emphasis on moral respectability, especially as a person of African descent throughout the Republican era. But as gender norms modernize, it creates tension between Black men and women. For instance, should Black women want the right to divorce? Like, what will that do to Black families in the image of the Black community? But it also increasingly, with the modernization of gender roles, allows for women to use those same presses and institutions to call out men for, say, domestic violence, for not respecting women in particular ways, as well as allowing women to enter the public sphere by establishing social reform institutions, right? And by holding say, their own soirees, their, trying to think of the translation, teaching people how to read and leading those kinds of campaigns, establishing libraries. So kind of pushing the bounds of what that can look like, but still very much being invested in respectability politics. Yes.
Thank you. We're going to open for one last question. 6:15. We always try to end by 6:30, and we have Adriana Chira.
Hi, Professor Brunson. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm a big fan. I have a question. It's a question about communism, and it's about a question about the 26th of July movement. So I wonder to what extent so many of our stories about social reform happening after '59 center on the white leadership of the movement, on Fidel Castro, on Che Guevara, on Camilo Cienfuegos, and so on. And I wonder to what extent you are actually telling us that there's so many conversations about redistribution and race-based redistribution and racial justice that had happened way before this leadership emerged in 1952 on the national scene in the organizations that you are describing. And even though these figures had a very tumultuous relationship with Blas Roca, right, the leader of the Communist Party and of the Partido Socialista Popular, they promoted him in the end, and they might have actually appropriated some of those discussions and networks that he and the people you are referring to, the women involved in the organizations, had been building. So in other words, I'm saying maybe your book is actually giving us the roots of the Communist Party of 1959 in the Black organizations, women's organizations, and women's groups. And it might also explain why the movement was so successful in the East, right? Well, Blas Roca was from, right? He was from Manzanillo, as far as I know. But I'll stop there. And thank you. This was it's a bit of a speculative question, but I just thought maybe you have thought about this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. So Michelle Chase in her work points out how the model of the Federation of Cuban Women, or the FMC, that is created during the 1960s is similar to the work that communist women had been engaging in during the 1950s. In the book, I argue that we can actually extend that backwards and think about the work that they were doing during the 1940s and even as early as the 1930s, and thinking about the cross-racial mobilizations that they engaged in that helped bring together women from various racial and class backgrounds, even in terms of the rhetoric that they use, their way of organizing people at multiple levels. Again, because like if you look at the communist newspaper, Noticias de Hoy, for instance, there are like neighborhood organizations and ways that they pull in women to sell newspapers. There are citywide organizations, there are regional organizations, and national. And these are also connected by the Democratic Federation of Cuban Women that emerges by the late 1940s. I really see the continuation of work that women of all races have been doing in the movement. What I then find fascinating in connecting that to what happens during the 1950s, and then especially after 1959, is what gets moved to the side. So on the one hand, I think there's a continuation of allowing women to organize in kind of like complementary parallel roles in comparison to the national party. But there's also this way that like race can be used to kind of mobilize women. And so I briefly talk about how like one of the Black women organizing during the 1940s publishes a piece in like 1959, I think it's August of 1959, in which he finally talks about race. And it's clearly to help mobilize Black women in support of the newly formed government. But then beyond that, it's kind of like, well, where did these women go during that early period, having previously had leadership positions at the national level, and then suddenly disappearing from that movement, right, over the next several decades. Yeah. So yeah, I just have a lot of questions about it as well. I use Devin Spence Benson's work to think through some of that, and certainly there's more that could be done. Thank you.
Hi, well, thank you, Adriana. And we have a little bit of time, so we do have time to ask you that one question that many of our sessions end with, which is what is next? Oh, sorry, I didn't notice that my camera was. What is next for you? I think one of the things that came out in the session today is how much work of connecting there's still to be done. Not by you only, of course. But of course, it strikes me how this method, that this kind of, to use a word that a Cuban friend of mine, Caterina Gonzalez Seligman, used with me in her dedication recently to her new book, Latin in the Caribbean magazine Time, which she says, we will always be scavengers of the archive. And the way that you went about like connecting these dots, I think about how these methods can be used to do Venezuela, Colombia, and then Dominican Republic. Like all of these places don't have that book yet. And I was wondering if this is where you're going. Your biography seems to indicate that you are going to go to other places. And I was wondering, are you going to take your method with you, or are you going to explore new methods as you do this? What's next for Takkara Brunson?
Oh, thank you for that question. So there's the Cuban piece, and then there's the kind of like diasporic piece. I think just smaller projects and thinking through some of the questions left unresolved when I was writing the book. So working class Black women's history, what does that look like? How can we think about that, not just in Havana, but in other parts of the island? The history of neighborhoods. So some of the best conversations that I've had with Black women in Cuba relates to their childhoods. And that's been the place where I've learned like to look at neighborhoods that I had been walking through for years in a completely different way because of how they're understood by spiritual communities, what their experience was like growing up in particular buildings and living alongside West Indian immigrants. So they're just like completely different ways of thinking about Cuban history and then Black women's history in Cuba from that standpoint. Of course, the oblates and then photography. Moving forward, my goal was to think about photography as a diasporic practice among women of African descent in Latin America. And so I've done very preliminary work in like Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay. But then what was fascinating is I started out looking at newspapers in some of these places, especially in Montevideo, and realized they're having very similar Black feminist conversations during the 1920s and 1930s. So there, of course, has been work that's looked at that to a certain extent, but I'm really interested in moving forward and thinking about what it is that leads Black communities of women to have particular political conversations, and in what ways we might think about them participating in not just like a comparative project, but really like a transnational project in which either through international women's organizations, labor organizations, international Black organizations, or specific like diasporic Black women's initiatives, they might be developing ideas about their experiences, their communities, related to the nation state, but also beyond that. Yeah. So I just have a ton of questions that I'm trying to think through. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Takkara, for sharing your work with us and our Slaveryarchive Book Club, for coming. And those of you who have your cameras on, you can give Takkara a round of applause, all the emojis. She deserves them all. And I want to invite you in the audience to join us for our next book club, which is going to take place on October 16. We are going to read Verena Krebs' Medieval Ethiopian Kingship Craft and Diplomacy with Latin Europe. It's going to be at 1 p.m. on a Saturday. I am going to post the link on the chat so that you guys can register for that. And thank you again for all of you who you are the ones who make this book club what it has been for a year and a half. Thank you all for coming again, and I hope to see you again on our next one.